Welcome to the Infinite Surface podcast. In this episode, we're lucky to have Brian Booth Craig, a sculptor putting a decidedly contemporary spin on the ancient tradition of sculpting from life and casting in bronze. Brian is a figurative sculptor who works directly from life models, and his command over the human body, gesture, anatomy, and composition is masterful. He employs that mastery to capture subtle moments of self-empowerment in the sculpted image of his models, a rare goal of an artist working from the model. The effortless appearance of his sculptures makes the anatomy seem obvious, and masks the labor-intensive processes that Brian employs to make his artworks from conception to final bronze. Brian also has a long career of teaching sculpture, and was the head of the sculpture department of the Lime Academy for over 10 years, which is where we met when I took his figure sculpture class during my brief stay there in 2010. Brian has since moved on to a more multifaceted way of approaching sculptural education. Leveraging his social media presence, Brian often hosts live conversations with other professionals in the field on his Instagram live feed, and has offered a plethora of workshops worldwide in cities such as Cape Town, Rio de Janeiro, and from his home studio. He also has founded his own school, the Rome Arts Residencies, which features an innovative style of teaching that combines art historical lessons from the old masters of Rome with a modern fine arts workshop focused on figure sculpting and representational art. I'm lucky to finally capture one of my conversations with Brian, as they are always long, meandering, but in-depth and fruitful meditations on art and life. In this episode, we discuss a variety of sculptural-related topics, such as the use of social media in a fine arts career, Brian's time apprenticing for the artist Audrey Flack, how Brian handles his work-life balance. And more broadly, we discuss our feelings on mold making, the distinction between abstraction and representation, and don't miss two really interesting conversations, one about sequentiality in sculpture, and the other about the importance of artist statements to help frame and convey meaning in art. Those happen towards the end, so don't miss those. So without further ado, welcome Brian Booth Craig to the Infinite Surface podcast. Okay. Brian Booth Craig, welcome to Infinite Surface Podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Jesse. I appreciate you asking me to join you, and looking forward to this. It's been a while since we've had a long conversation.
Yeah, Brian and I just talked not too long ago, and every time we talk, I feel like I wish I had recorded it, because I feel like we talk about such wonderful topics and so deeply that I feel like they're a podcast every time.
Yeah, and I feel like we could go on for much longer too.
We'll have to watch that. But you've been doing a decent amount of talks and podcasts, like on your Instagram, for instance. You've been doing a lot of like live conversations. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, correct.
Yeah, and so what brought that on, or who are you doing that with, and what are those about?
Well, that was really brought on by COVID.
Yeah.
Because obviously one of the most difficult parts of the last 12 months has been the lack of social interaction. And I'm used to traveling. I'm used to meeting lots of people, whether it's going to Rome and teaching a class, or going to Brazil, or I was supposed to go to Australia. I had classes planned for St. Petersburg, Russia, South Africa, and of course all of that was canceled. Yeah. And so I just felt like I needed to scratch that itch a little bit, interaction with people and reconnect with people that I hadn't seen for a while, that I wanted to see, but I didn't get a chance to. And so that's really what prompted it. It was just thinking that I really want to make these connections again. The other thing that prompted that idea was the fact that I know a lot of cool people. I know a lot of really interesting people. And I feel like one of the advantage of social media is that we're supposed to be able to share information and share the things that we look at, things that we like. And I think that the way that social media is now structured in terms of its algorithm and the way it's meant to maximize the monetary function of the app, doesn't really give you the kind of expansive interaction that the early days of, say, Facebook or Instagram had. Right, there seems to be like that social part is breaking down a little bit. That's at least my experience. Yeah. And, I think that the early days of me being on Facebook, I met so many people. It was amazing the amount of interaction that I got from strangers all around the world, and eventually I would meet them teaching a class or traveling somewhere, or run into them in New York, whatever that was. And that's becoming a little more difficult. So I felt like, I just wanted to maintain connections and try to build some new ones and introduce people to some people that I think are cool. And it wasn't, the other thing is that I didn't want it to be like this, like a podcast. I want to just be like two friends chatting. In fact, you and I should do one, just like you have a drink, I have a drink, and we just kind of go off and answer people's questions. And the live format's a little different from the podcast. I've done several podcasts. I've been on quite a few. Yeah. And one of the key differences, and this was the other thing that prompted it. I'm sorry, this is a very long answer, but that's good. There was actually a lot of thought that went into it. Yeah. The other thing that I liked about that format is that it's live, so people can ask questions or chime in. Some people joke, or people say all kinds of things. It has its glitches. It's not perfect. I think Instagram's not the ideal format for that, but it's been fun at least, and I think people are enjoying them. So I've been doing that, but it doesn't have the interview format that say a podcast does, or radio or a magazine interview, that sort of thing. So anyway, that's what that was. And I'm going to continue doing them, and every couple weeks or so I'll do one with a friend or a colleague. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm in some ways, compared to you, I'm like right at the beginning of having some kind of social media presence, and it has been a slow trickle. And I think a lot of things have changed from like 5 or 6 years ago, where maybe you can build up like a big following quickly. It's really like a slow trickle right now. And one of the conversations I had about with somebody who does fairly well in terms of monetizing, and is like a real true artist. It's actually the person who wrote the intro music to this podcast, named Kevin McAndrews, and he goes by Numb the Geek, and he's one of the truest like artists I've ever known. He just loves music. He does it for no other reason than loving it. And the idea of making any money for it is like entirely secondary, and sometimes even almost problematically. Sometimes I'm like, Kevin, please make some money from this. But he has sort of but he has sort of figured something out, and he's made this kind of like, we talked about it for a while, and he's made this kind of triangulation where he's used several different platforms to sort of point at each other. And that's the thing, like something like Discord, for instance, is like an online platform that's much more like communicative and more like a hangout session, almost like Google Group or Google Chill or whatever that was like 5 years ago. So online conversations might be well had on something like Discord, whereas like Instagram is more like people watching, but the interface for like asking questions and things like that isn't as smooth, I think, in Instagram. But all this stuff takes a social media manager. It's like you have to really develop this stuff. It's not easy. So
it's not easy, but I do feel that it's a necessary thing for creatives. In so many ways. I think, first of all, because the creative economy is much bigger than just where you live. Even if you're in New York City, the creative capital, at least for the fine art world, it's a much bigger ecosystem, and it's an ecosystem that's far more diverse than you can even imagine in your own home. And that's one of the great advantages of it. And I think if you're creative today, you're not only is it beneficial to your creative life, but your career to be on these platforms. The problem, of course, is they weren't invented for us.
Right.
They were invented. These things were not designed for people like you and me. Yeah. I'm fortunate in that I got on to these things right at the time when people were starting to utilize them for their creative pursuits. And so I got enough of a following that there's some momentum, but it is slowing down, and that's because of the algorithms and whatever. But I do think that I'm grateful for these platforms. I'm not one of these people who's sort of like angry at Instagram or Facebook because they don't do what I want them to do. They weren't designed for me. I'm an interloper in a way. and so I'm very grateful for the fact that they've connected to me these two people, and it's made money for me in other ways. Maybe not quite as easily as somebody who's a musician, for example, like your friend, but I have found them beneficial to be on them and active. It's a bit exhausting. It's another job, but it is enjoyable as well. So it's how to monetize it. It's a whole other matter.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, it seems to me like that the concept that I've grasped onto is that pointing thing, and the thing about being an individual artist is that the amount of people pointing at you in a day versus, like, let's say, I don't know, like a brand that has marketing strategies and has like maybe several Instagram pages that are pointing at each other and things like that. So you notice the algorithm just went from like interaction, like comments meaning less and hearts meaning less, to like sharing and saving meaning more. So that kind of shift, means that you have to be working kind of, in concert with a couple people or a couple groups. So the idea that, as an individual, you can just sprout, I think is less and less.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. And think about this. When did we meet? We met probably, 2010?
Something like that,
9?
Yeah.
Could you imagine having this conversation back then? And it's kind of amazing when you think about it, that this has become so integral to what we do.
Yeah, we didn't have any kind of conversation like that. It wasn't anything to do with it. Yeah.
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, I resisted these things for quite a while.
Yeah, sure.
And, because I didn't want to get bogged down in it. Right. And now it's become just another part of life, the creative life. Yeah. But I do think, I think that, whether these platforms are aware of it or not, I think creatives are really they're the leaven, right? They're leavening the bread. This is like, I think that they may not be aware of this, but we, just like everything else, we're going into the rundown areas and gentrifying it.
Right.
We're like, we really are. I think this, there's, because real content, the real interesting content, creative content is what's going to last.
Yeah. Right.
Not what I had for breakfast and took a picture of. Right. Unless I'm a chef.
Right.
And then,
exactly.
then it might be, then that has some cultural value because it can spread in unique ways. But I do think that we're providing a service. That's the way I like to. I think.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, it's strange that's like almost the start of every conversation now is how are we navigating this odd space that really isn't the physical act of making things, but is necessary to it.
Exactly. Yeah. And 20, 50, 60 years ago, that had something to do with somehow being chosen or identified by these higher powers that, hopefully they like you, hopefully they choose you and they show you and they represent you. Right. And if you're in their good graces, then you're good. And if you're not, then you never are.
Right.
And, I think in some ways I might prefer it how it is now, because at least there's some autonomy to it, and the ways in which we're married and bound to basically art market stuff, this is another conversation, but art is not art market, right? Like I mean, it's two totally different things. I was talking with one of my students introducing this concept, and I said, well, like being a fish is not the same thing as the person eating a fish, right? It's like, what it means to be a fish is much different than what it means to have a fish be eaten. And, so I find like there's quite a bit of autonomy to it and quite a bit of interconnectivity that obviously was never there, or was just completely controlled by someone else. And I enjoy that. But it's murky waters like anything. But I mean, for you, if we're talking about 2010, like the amount of shifts that you've made in not in your practice necessarily. I mean, definitely in the artistic output, there's quite a bit of shifts. But in terms of how you go about your day to day, like it's massively different, because at that point when we met, you were teaching at the Lime Academy.
Right.
So you had a pretty
Full-time job.
Full-time run-of-the-mill professorship at a, you know, a college that pretty well suited your specialty and your interests. And you've shifted from that into doing these like international workshops and into doing like, you know, like whatever else, like these online conversations and this kind of stuff, while still maintaining like a gallery presence, right? You still show with, what's the name of your gallery again?
Louis K. Mizell Gallery in New York City.
So, you know, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, like what it's been, and you've also started your own school, right? You have the
sort of, yeah.
Yeah, sort
well,
of.
COVID's kind of like, you know, put everything on hold. So it's,
yeah. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what that was like to transition from that kind of like you know, dividing your time between a professorship and the studio, and then how that's been, you know, different or improved or not, you know, for what you're doing now.
Yeah, I think one way to begin discussing that is to go even further back, a little bit further back, which is, you know, I originally, for many years, I worked as a studio assistant to Audrey Flack. I was, you know, it was almost 11 years I did that, and that was a different kind of balance. When I was working for her, primarily working for her, I was doing a lot of her work and a little bit of my work, but I was still kind of finding my way in terms of the kind of work I wanted to do, and I hadn't quite decided, you know, what direction I was going to take with my own work. So that was more of like both working as assistant and also being mentored by somebody.
Right.
When I transitioned to teaching at Lime, and there was a little bit of a crossover there. I was still working for Audrey and teaching at Lime and doing my own work. Right. And so then I eventually, you know, I moved away from working as an assistant and became a full-time professor. And I was and of course at the time I had kids as well. So I had 2 daughters with my ex-wife. Well, we weren't exes when we had the kids, but since then, clarify that. So that was a very busy time, and I found it really difficult to balance, frankly. The part of it was where I was teaching and where I was living. So I was living 4 hours away from the college and staying overnights, and when I get home, I had, you know, obviously I had kids and all of this. So my production was a little slower simply because of the fact that I was juggling quite a bit there.
Yeah. And what would you do? You would commute 4 hours for, like, would you stay over a couple of days, or would
I'd stay over a couple of days?
So you would just camp out on campus for like 3 days or something like
3
that?
3 days, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, teach a couple of days and meetings, whatever came up, I would have to. The school was very, very good about compacting my schedule so that I wasn't scheduled for a Monday and a Friday and a Wednesday and have to, you know, I'd be there all week. It was usually Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, drive home Wednesday, that sort of thing. Wow. But you can imagine what that would do, because I couldn't. Unlike if the college had been closer, I would have been more productive, most likely, because I could have just gone home, do a couple of hours of work. But you know, I couldn't carry my studio to Connecticut.
You know, sculpture is not conducive to such things.
It's not very mobile, right. So I found that my production for quite a while was kind of low because of that. Just the number of things that were going on. And what happened was when Louis Mizell wanted to represent me, the first thing he said in the meeting was, he said, "You need to drop something from your schedule." He said, "You're too busy, you're doing too many things, you know, you really need to cut something out." And so that was the thing to go, essentially, was teaching at the university. And there were lots of other reasons for doing that besides just wanting to cut one thing out. I was also, like, as you said, I was starting to transition into teaching workshops and realizing that if I were to maintain both of those, I would not have time to do artwork.
No way, yeah. That's
so
a lot of teaching.
It just it's a lot of teaching and a lot of time away from home. And so I found that it was much more lucrative to do some workshops and, you know, and pepper that income with a little bit of sales here and there from the gallery, and some, you know, that fluctuates. And that was the formula that seemed to work for me in terms of increase in production. I mean, granted, there are lots of other things, you know, that are unseen in an artist's life, and that people may not be aware of. For example, my kids when they're older. So it sounds simple, but the reality is that there's a big difference between a 2-year-old and a 12-year-old. Right. It's a huge difference, and so there's a lot more autonomy. And there's a lot more opportunity for me to get work done. And the gallery is pushing my work, so I was making some money there. And that helps. And that helps enormously. And so it's interesting what you were saying, because before the thing we were talking about prior to this was the hierarchical system of the art world, and how the social media and the internet has created a new paradigm for artists in terms of their income streams, but the hierarchy still is there. I mean, it still has a lot of validity, despite what complaints people have about it. I think it has a lot of validity. It still has a lot of power, and there is still a respectability to being in a good gallery and exhibiting, and it is a pathway to museum shows and collections and that sort of thing. So it does exist still, and I don't think it's going to go away entirely. But back to the question, my productivity was a function of that kind of shift, and I really think that artists should be aware of this, the way careers do shift over time, and these are natural things that happen and necessary. That because your work is going to change, your life is going to change, the way your outlook on how you work is going to change. Hopefully, I mean that hopefully it changes. And once I got I think and to be really, really frank about it, a big part of it was just a sense of confidence that I finally figured out what I really wanted to do. About 15 years ago. Prior to that, I think I didn't really have the confidence to put all my chips down. I was still hedging my bets a little bit, right? And now, I don't have any chips left. They're all in the middle of the table.
Well, what does that mean? Tell us more about that. Were you experimenting with other kinds of media, or were you, looking to invest more in teaching than in making, or what does that mean in terms of the shift?
I'm speaking specifically about the production of my own artwork. Okay. Yep. And just putting as many resources as I could into that. Right. A simple example is the building I'm sitting in right now, which is a relatively new studio building last couple of years. And I just decided, and I'd been planning to do this for a while. This wasn't just a spur of the moment decision. These things don't happen that quickly. But it had been planned for many years before that. But I finally just said I have to pull the trigger on this. I have to. If I don't do it now, I may never do it. And part of the reason for doing it was just to have bigger space to do larger pieces, to have assistants. I have an apprentice here right now who's staying with me for 3 months. Okay. And so I have a space for him, area for him to work, and so which I didn't have before. Right. So that's an example of pushing the chips into the center of the table.
Exactly.
Hopefully the bet pays off. But I've done that in various ways throughout my career, at different obviously different levels of investment and engagement with that process. But I do think that that's something every artist needs to know. Is that you have to know when is the right time to make those shifts and to put a bet on yourself, and your work. And I think when I was much younger, I didn't really have the confidence to do that. It had to slowly build. I had to get to the point where I was. And look, I'm not fully confident now. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that this isn't. I'm still in a process. I'm still growing in this and figuring out a career. Careers are things that you assess when you at the end, right? Not in the middle.
Yeah. Well, careers are things that other people assess after you're
exactly.
Done, right?
Exactly.
I had a good career.
Exactly.
Exactly. Well, it's kind of like a metaphor for the process of figure sculpture, figure drawing is always one of, you're creating building blocks and then refining that into details, and that's a question of commitment. When do you commit? When do you feel the confidence to go further, go deeper in, or how long do you stay in this kind of like nebulous space of designing a composition or constructing or sketching, and this kind of metaphor or this process, it scales up and down, I feel like, in the entirety of the artist's life, right? And like you're saying, your life shifts. Not only that, but I feel like your relationship to whatever we consider to be the public shifts also, like whether that's people buying or not buying your work, whether that's people sharing or not sharing your work online. Like these things go in waves. And I feel like, when I was 19, my idea was like, person like, I don't know, Jackson Pollock makes it and then he's made it. Or like, Brian's got this many followers and then he's like good. And you don't have to worry about anything anymore. And the art just flows, and I found in my career that is not the case. And I've never met anyone that just, got on the train and didn't have to get off for any stops, like I've never met anyone like that.
They do exist, but they are very rare.
Yeah, I mean, but
and they're usually trust fund kids.
Right, but even still, I've met a few of those, and they all have a professorship here or there. They all have breaks and stops, and I like you. I got the chance. You were talking about working with as an assistant. I worked at the Johnson Atelier for a bunch of years, and the kinds of artists that would come through that foundry were sometimes, very well known, very famous. Kiki Smith, George Siegel, Charles Ray, people like that. And, these are people in your mind that are just like, they have no problems, right? And it turns out they have problems. They have financial problems, they have time commitment problems, they have personal interruptions. So, I found that up and down that ladder, whether you're talking about A-list or whatever comes below that artist, they're all compromising studio time, work time, personal time, and drawing up an equation that is not, A, it's not consistent, B, it's not clean or clear cut, and you get, I feel like this sometimes is fed by these notions where you're like, okay, what does Stephen King do in a day? Well, he wakes up at 6 and he reads for 1 hour, and then he writes for an hour, and then he has tea, and then he talks with his daughter. It's like and I'm sure that
it sounds so neat and clean.
Yeah, and it sounds like every day he writes a perfect page, and that he never balls it up and throws it out or gets frustrated, and that just can't be the case, right? And so that kind of maturing into that understanding is it. I feel like it again, like anything else, like you don't mature into that understanding perfectly. Like there's days when I can feel quite intimidated by looking around online and being like, Gerhard Demetz has a perfect life, look at that guy's studio and look at that guy's work, and he just pumps it out, and and it takes quite a bit of concentration almost sometimes to remind myself, like, nobody's got it easy no matter what.
That's true. That's true. I mean, if you're going to be an artist, it's going to be a struggle. No matter, that's just the reality. Right. It's not, and a struggle, I don't mean a struggle in the sense that poverty necessarily, or loneliness or whatever, right? I mean just a struggle in the constant fight to maximize the use of your time in such a way that fulfills the best urges of your creative self. Right. Yeah, that's not easy. Even when you and this is where I think it comes down to being a non-financial issue, because you think of somebody who is very successful, who makes very large sculptures, say, or paintings. And they have a lot of assistants, and they have a lot of these projects going on around the world, and they have a certain image to maintain in the character of the work. Now that sounds great, but what if you do that for 10 years and you start to get tired of it, and you really want to do, and you do get tired of it, and you want to do something that is a little more intimate, or doesn't require the mechanism of that system to keep it going. That's just the reality. And what I've found, and this is actually very pertinent to my present situation, because I've found that you have to. I think artists need to find little ways to reward themselves, right? Little ways to sort of satisfy the immediacy of the creative need,
right?
Because, and the reason for that is, when, like, for example, if I have a show coming up, I will spend 6 months doing production work, bronze work, right? Not creative work, just like bronze work. Sometimes a little
down
less,
dirty
but
grinding.
It's down and dirty grinding and managing other people and trying to get the stuff together, and it's not easy to do. It can really drain you. If I'm teaching for a month somewhere, same thing. And then what happens is that sort of habit of production then enters the studio.
Right.
So for example, I have about 30 pieces in my studio right now that I'm working on, right? Because what happened to me was I started to get very exhausted by the ending of the process of each piece. So if people who look at my work will see this, that there's a certain amount of attention to the finish of things that requires some tedious work, whether that's a bronze work or the wax work for bronze casting or mold making or the finishing of the surface. And the part that I love the most is the beginning.
Right, of course, yeah.
Like the part I love the most is when everything is just emerging and it's sort of autochthonously emerging from the clay, it's like literally autochthonous, right? Because it's clay, right? It's coming out of the earth, right? And so that's the part that I get the most satisfaction with, right? And then, what happened? I developed this habit started a couple of years ago, where I would get excited by an idea and start pursuing it and blocking it out, and then I would just move on to another one, right? Because it's almost avoiding the next step,
right?
And also, it wasn't just that it wasn't just a sense of avoidance. It was also that I got so much energy from that starting something that it spun off on these tangents of thought that made me want to do another piece. And so what ended up happening was I have all these pieces in my studio that are unfinished, and then I realized, I need to start finishing these.
Yeah.
Now I was right, but so now I was trapped, because now I had 30 pieces where all the fun part was done. And now I have to finish all of these.
Yeah, now not 6 months. Now it's like a year and a half of process
right.
work.
Probably a year and a half, 2 years. So obviously I'm going to finish them, because they're all of them have seeds of ideas that I still need to develop. I don't. My process is very. It may look from the end product like it's very predetermined, but it's not at all. I'm very much I'm very responsive in my studio practice. Like if I'm using a model, I get the model in. I don't know what I'm going to do before they arrive. I have parameters, of course. I'm not just going to randomly start doing something. It would be a waste of time and money. But it's a fairly open-ended set of parameters. Okay, and so that is a very exciting procedure for me, and it's something that unfolds over the development of an idea as I work. Like it's in the working that the idea develops, not beforehand. And so anyway, getting back to what I was saying, a little bit of an aside there, but what I was saying is that I found myself in this cul-de-sac, right? And now this gets back to the point. I'm going to pull this all the way back around to what we were saying. But I found myself in this cul-de-sac where I have all these pieces that need my attention to finish them. But they're all going to be, there's going to be a tediousness to each of them at a certain stage. That's just the way art is. There's just, whether it's framing or shipping something, there are all these things that you have to do that are not creative. They're not fun. So anyway, mold making is not the funnest thing, as you can attest.
I can attest to that fully.
Yeah.
Me and everybody who's ever helped me can attest. It is high stress, low reward.
That's right, and high risk.
Yeah, high risk. That's right.
But so anyway, I know I have that coming down the pipe. So what I started to do was get models in for quick sessions, just sketching clay.
Yeah.
Things so if you go to my Instagram now, you'll see I've started to post a little bit of it. about 5 of them now. And I'm going to start firing terracottas of just
Right.
things that I can do within 5 hours or less.
And
right?
call it finished,
and
right? Yeah.
and call it and just say that's it, I'm done, because getting into that, just having that as part of my studio practice, it releases the tension of all the other things that are there. Now, where I bring that back to what we were saying about the struggle of being an artist and all these different traps that we can find ourselves in, even if you have all the money in the world, you're going to find these traps exist, and so. What I think every artist needs to do is find ways to reward themselves like that, and be very aware of what they're getting out of the process at each particular stage, and not let themselves get pulled in directions that are going to be unsatisfying, emotionally and spiritually unsatisfying. Because the reality is, you all have to do that. Just like we all want to eat the nice dinner and have a nice meal, but somebody's got to do the dishes.
That's right. Somebody's got to cook it. Somebody's got to cook it,
and somebody's got to do the dishes. Right.
Yeah.
So it's just like that. It's just like that. I mean, and it's really, I like what you said about the metaphor too. That it is a metaphor for life. I've learned a lot about life from being an artist.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'll go back and pick up a thread that you kind of left there dangling a little bit, was you talked about how when you're working on art, you look at the big picture, you're looking at everything, you're looking at the whole, the gestalt of the thing, and then you break it down.
Yeah.
And then you go back to the gestalt, and then you break it down. That's the way life is too, and that's the way careers are. That's the way it is to be an artist. You have to have the long-term big vision, but you also have the daily practice where you say, I'm going to do something today for my work to incrementally get myself there, and then you reassess it every few months to say, okay, where am I going? Where do I want to go? And that's going to change. I think the thing about being an artist is, the fun part of being an artist is not that you know that you're going to make something great, but that you know that you're going to be on a journey that's interesting. Like, that's it. Like, that's that's the way life should be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's what you sign up for, right? You sign up for a lifestyle in a way, and you commit to it, and you earn that lifestyle by putting something into the world that is of some value, or you hope, and that's how you get by. That's how you continue to be an artist, right? But you, and I think it's interesting what you're talking about, because like I often say, like the graph for making an artist, or for making an artwork rather, looks like this. It's like, you start with the idea and it's awesome, and then you have to make the thing and it's not, and then you finish it and it's awesome. Like especially these labor intensive, just about any sculptural process is labor intensive. And then for me, like the drawings that I make also take like a really long, like 200 plus hours, and I think the way in which the marks are made, I always joke about this, because the way in which the marks are made in my drawings I think people say, oh, that must have been so much fun to draw. And it was, right? Like, it was fun to draw, and it is a good life. And I do appreciate the world giving me the opportunity to spend the time to make the thing, and all the people that look at it and like it, and that's so great. But like, working 240 hours in like 17 days to like have an exhibition of this thing, like that, like, that would be a medical condition if I was fun the whole time. Like, I mean, I'd have to go to the hospital if that was fun the whole time. So, like it's just not like fun is not what I'm after. Pure unbridled joy and inspiration is not what I'm after, in my artistic process. It really is like that bigger picture of life, like this is the life that I've chosen. And what I think what's interesting about an artist, and you're a really good example of this, is like a banker, for instance. Like a banker, a few bankers start a bank, but most bankers work for a bank, meaning that they're involved in an institution and an economy that already pre-exists. And when you were talking about maximizing your creative energy, and maybe just like, let's just say like maximizing your work, like, I don't know that bankers do that, like I don't know that the 8-hour workday is like the most efficient, most creative, most good for the world system. But what they have is they have an economy that buffers that. So all of the waste and all of the, the time spent taking trips to the coffee room or chatting at the water cooler, like that, those parts are taken out of the creative process. Whereas any artist, just about, unless they sign up with an institution, unless they're like an animator working for DreamWorks or something like that, any artist who's working independently has to create their own structure in life and their own economy in life. And we can get help for that through an institution like a college or a university or a gallery, and that will provide some structure, but that immediately takes away from the product that you're required to give to maintain the position in that structure. So it's a very difficult equation to figure out for an artist, but it's fun every time. I shouldn't say fun because I don't like that word, but it's rewarding in a very different way. Because you own
and there are moments of fun too.
It's true. I'm not trying to say it's not fun. It's the best life. For me, it's the best life. But I'm a person who's I don't know about you, but I'm fairly comfortable with a certain level of insecurity and ambiguity especially of outcome. And so I'm willing to take big time risks and big energy risks to hope that the outcome of this thing is worth being in the world, is worth putting into, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that's something that, if you're working at a bank, you don't have to worry about like, look, I'm just going to work. You don't have to worry about like, is it worth it for me to go to work for the entire economy of this situation to continue? You might think about that, but you're not required to just go to work. But for us, we're managing that, and that's the way you put that together is pretty interesting at this point, because there's so many pieces to it, and so the work,
I'm adding more pieces too. That's the thing; it's not going to stop. I'm going to be adding pieces to that. Just like you're adding a podcast.
I did add a job to my life. I don't know why. Why did I do that? I can't remember. But it's for the same reason. I'm living in Singapore, and I'm not able to travel to the U.S., and I miss you, and I miss my mom, and I should just have my mom on my podcast and just catch up, because I miss her,
She can show all of your artwork from when you were a kid.
Exactly right. My mom can just be like, and this one, and this one. Those are still her favorite artworks, I think. She enjoys my more mature works, I think, but I'm certain that her favorites are the ones that were made while I was at home.
Yeah. Well, that's actually that makes me think of another thing here, which is that one of the dilemmas I think that we face, in this process that we're talking about of maturing as an artist and growing as an artist, which is a better word maybe, and unfolding everything that is possible for yourself with the whatever innate abilities and ideas and characteristics you have. The thing is that when you get to that stage when you make something and you put it out in the world, the satisfaction of it being completed and that graph you described, right, is now complicated by so obviously selling is one thing, but now it's complicated by social media, and this is something I've been really thinking about a lot, because I think it's altering behaviors for everybody, and artists included. And I think this is something that that we need to be very cautious about, because the likes are not a determiner of the value of a thing.
Right. And neither is the sale, right?
And neither is the sale. But the sales obviously are more, applicable to your satisfaction because you have something you put in your bank account. But and it can help you continue going to other things. But I do worry about how it's affecting me, and I see in the other artists how it might be affecting them. Is it any way changing my behavior in order to I don't think it is, but I need to. I'm constantly aware of it these days, because I think it's natural that we would change what we do because of the social the social pressures that we feel, the financial pressures that we feel, and some of that is natural. Some of that is just given being an artist. In other words, I mean, the simple way of saying it is nobody wants to be a sellout to themselves, right?
Yeah.
We all want to feel like you described your friend at the beginning of this conversation. The friend is a musician who he's playing music because he loves music.
Right.
I'm making sculpture because I love sculpture. But the reality is, I also want to feel like it resonates beyond me in some fashion. Otherwise,
must, right?
because in some sense, I don't really matter that much.
Right.
I don't. As an individual, I don't really.
I think you matter, Brian.
Right. Well, you understand what I mean, though, which is that I mean, on a personal level, to some people, I matter, but on the when it comes down to the pursuit of the human pursuit of creativity, is a cumulative thing that hopefully I want to be part of. I want to be in. I want my work to be part of it.
Right. Part of the conversation.
I want it to be exactly. I want it to be in conversation with your work, and I want my work to be in conversation with artwork that doesn't look at all like my work. Right. I want it to be in that same dialogue. But I also don't want to overthink that and start to force it. I don't want to force it to be that in conversation. I want it to sort of naturally and organically flow out of the studio into that conversation. So I do think about that sometimes. In the last few years, especially, I've thought about it because it seems like it's becoming a more salient feature of our lives as artists. And I think we need to be a little bit cautious of that. I'll give you an example. Okay, now one of the things that about being a sculptor that's a little frustrating, okay, aside from the financial concerns and the hard work, I actually don't mind. But by the way, I actually really love things like grinding bronze and and there's certain aspects of that, like the grind and the physical work, that I really do love. Mold making is not one of them, but that's more because it's a mental strain.
Chemical, dirty process,
right? And it's a mental strain. It's a real mental.
Yeah. There's a high risk there. That's
Right.
Actually when I first started mold making, I was trying to farm it out, and you probably know how difficult it is to find anybody that'll do it, and even if you find a professional, they don't want to do it because it's so high risk. And it's so low, it's not enough money for the risk. Because if they mess it up, and they can, even if they're
it's on them.
It's on them, and they have to make it right somehow, and that can cost them a month of work. It can ruin their life. So we have that just casually in the studio all the time. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, exactly. It's extremely stressful when you have to do that. I don't mind the other physical hard work.
Yeah.
But where was I going with that? I was going to say something about the process of making. I don't know what it was. I'll come back to it. It'll come back to me. It's not a big deal. It's not. I don't think it must not have been a major point because I would have remembered if it was. But I think the reward of being an artist is the pursuit of a thought process and a line of thinking, and finding the natural way of doing that for yourself is what you have to stick to. Because if you think about everybody else and think about like you say, you look at all these artists who are successful. What am I doing? What are they doing? What am I doing? I think if you start to look too much outside of yourself, it can be a problem in the studio. You have to trust yourself a little bit. That doesn't mean you shouldn't push yourself. I always tell people I look at everything. I'm very open. I want to see everything. I'm curious. I'm a naturally curious person, and I would be that way even if I wasn't an artist.
My cats are fighting in the distant background, so there's going to be some cat fight sounds going on.
That's okay. Yeah. I lock my cats and my dog in the studio. So
smart.
Yeah.
They're very podcast oriented.
Yeah, I'm aware. I'm very aware of this stuff. Yeah, I've had some interruptions. It's not a big deal though. It's I don't know where I was going with that. There was actually a point I was going to make.
Well, you were talking about validation. Actually, I think you were talking about getting likes and being careful about changing your behavior. to suit these likes.
Right. That's right. Okay, now I know what I was going to say. Actually, this is a kind of a big point, actually. One of the things I think that's frustrating about being a sculptor, and this has always been an issue, well, especially it's been developing over the last couple hundred years. Traditionally, sculpture was always a fairly public and interactive art form, in the sense that it required an architectural space or a space. It required a design sense that included the viewer as an element in the narrative quality of the sculpture. Okay, so it qualitatively couldn't be sculpture without the viewer's interaction within that space, right? It's just like it would be a completely different thing. Now, what's happened is, and this is partly the market for art and the way it's developed, and partly the taste has changed. Sculpture and most art has become gallery art. So in other words, you make a sculpture, you put it on a pedestal, it goes in a gallery, right? And now there's an aspect of that that's really satisfying, but there's also an aspect of that that's a little bit unsatisfying because the public for it is so small, right? That you really are not getting a full sense of how people are taking it in and interacting with it and so forth. Now, of course, in the past, those interactions could be quite negative. Like Carpeau, his La Dance at the Garnier Opera House was somebody threw, paint at it and splattered it with paint. And Michelangelo's David, when they set it up, people threw stones at it. People threw stones at it because, so there's always that side of it, of course. But it's the frustration of not having the ability to put things in a public space. Maybe this is my appeal to anyone who hears this podcast who might have the means and the space to do it. Commission me to make a sculpture for a space. I mean, this is one of the frustrations that I feel. That I don't think it's an artistic language that is well understood today by the public. Not their fault, of course, and doesn't really have a space for it like it used to, and so that's the one thing I would say that's a little frustrating about the being a sculptor today. I don't I love my gallery. I love collectors who buy my work and put it in their homes. It's great, and I love seeing it when they send me pictures and I see it. I mean, it's great. I love that. That's only half the picture, right? That's really only half the picture.
There's something I've actually always wanted to talk to you about this, and we've never talked about this yet, so this is a good time to do it. When I was coming up through school, there was this sense that, not a sense, it was explicitly stated by teachers, by art world people, that there was this massive shift in the abstract expressionist period, like the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, away from figuration. And at least in the American conversation, it basically, somehow ends with Thomas Eakins and then shifts immediately to like Dada or something like that. And then we're into Jackson Pollock and that's where it's going.
The plug was pulled there and it was done.
Right. And to an extent, I understand that because certain like atelier style or certain training methodologies were no longer favored in like university systems or in college systems, or and then some of them somehow maybe anyway there just seemed to be less and less opportunity. So I think you mentioned this in one of your previous podcasts, and I'd say it as well. When I was coming up in New Jersey in the 80s, 90s, before I went to art college, there was just nothing to be found in terms of like serious art training. In a figurative sense. You could take a class here or there with like a lady in her basement, but that person wasn't a professional artist. They were more of like an arts educator, which is great and gets you started, but it doesn't get you like deadly serious right away. So but my view on this is a complicated one, because I feel like the figurative arts and the methodologies never really went anywhere. They went somewhere in terms of like the most popular culture, meaning like what was supported and pronounced by the galleries and by our government as like what's unique and what's going on. But the public and the population and the general art student, like still like 5 out of 10, if not 7 out of 10 art students, were still completely enamored with realism, with naturalism, with mannerism or something like that, with some form of representation.
Totally.
And so there is this historical note that just says like figuration became irrelevant over this time. And while Norman Rockwell was working during that period, that didn't matter that much. And my argument to that is like, yes, it did. Yes, it did for, so many people. And anyway, so I wanted to get your view on that. Like, do you?
Yeah, that's a great topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually, so I agree with you. I believe that narrative is a false one.
Yeah.
I don't think. First of all, we could back up a little bit. I think the line between the idea of there's a clean dividing line between abstraction and representation is a red herring. It's an intellectual red herring. Everything is abstraction.
Yeah. Right. It's a false dichotomy anyway.
It's a false dichotomy. It doesn't exist. All art is an abstraction, right? Yeah. Unless you would say I'm a work of art, which that'd be fine. You could say I'm a work of art if you like.
Brian.
but you get the point. Like everything that we make is an abstraction. It's abstract. Literally means pulled away from, right? Its source, right? Its source is it's moving away from its source.
Yeah. So the only artwork which wouldn't be an abstraction would be something that you perfectly mistake for reality. And that doesn't mean like a convincing movie or like a convincing animation. That means you accidentally perfectly mistake it for reality.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And,
right. That would not be an abstraction.
Yeah.
That would be the thing that it is.
Yeah. And so even a hyper-real sculpture is an abstraction because it doesn't move and it doesn't breathe and it doesn't live. So until those become automatons where they do live, that would be a realistic sculpture. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you go, on a philosophical level, you could say that all of experience is an abstraction.
Right.
Because it isn't the thing itself, right? It's a mediated interpretation.
This is Plato's cave in a way, right?
Right. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't obviously gradations within this, right? So abstract expressionism is we recognize it. See, here's the thing that people say, well, it's not figurative, it's not representational. No, it is. Because when you look at it, what's implied is his hand moving over the canvas.
Right. Yeah.
That is the point.
It's made.
It's
right.
Right. Yeah. Right. And the implication, like the representation is the representation of a movement of a man in space. Right. Now that may seem like a little bit of a like a justification for the argument I'm trying to make, but it's real. That is, you can't. In other words, it's kind of like here's a closer example would be when you look at a Rodin and you see the mark of his, you see his hand, right? The print of his hand on the surface. What's implied there is not just the thing that it's representing in its physical form, but it's in its absent form as well, right? It's representing the person who made it. So there are various elements of representation.
Yeah. I think there's a philosophical kind of thread. I'm not a good philosophy person, but there's an idea that says something like, if you find a stopwatch like open on the beach, you could never mistake that for natural. Meaning there's no clues visually in nature that would suggest that a stopwatch wasn't made by a person. So the only way you can understand that is by understanding that men make things or people make things, and so So that's I think that's kind of what you're saying, is that no matter how Barnett Newman you become, you can't understand that painting was anything but made by a person, by mankind. Yeah.
Right. Another way to say that is that all human beings were creatures that perform creative actions. And sometimes those actions have long-standing consequences. Sometimes they don't. Right. Sometimes they're very temporal.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's sort of the background to what I was going to say in answer to the question that you opened up about this story, that there was that figuration died. It was killed off, right? And then people had to resuscitate it somehow. This is the story, and this is a story that a lot of people within. I like to use the word representational, by the way. I prefer that because I think it's a little broader and
it's broader.
It's a little broader, and oddly it's broader and more precise at the same time. Right. I think one of the reasons that story has become prominent among people who are involved in the sort of representation, utilizing techniques from the 19th century, say, for example, is that the reason they say that is because the kind of representation that they do wasn't, that particular technique was set aside for a while. But the reality is, if you look at art during that period, who else was making art at the time of the abstract expressionists? Jacques Remy, Germain Richier, Ewan Ugolo, Lucian Freud, Francis Bacon, who famously called Jackson Pollock that lace maker. He derisively called him a lace maker. He said he's not an artist; he's a lace maker. That's the way Francis Bacon would have.
That's a funny insult, but also compliment.
I know it's good. It's good.
Yeah, but not just the fine arts side. Don't forget that's the golden age of American illustration. There's a ton of incredible, representational illustrators that are working at the time that people are holding in their hands in a magazine. Yeah. And so you're talking about gallery artists. You're talking about museum artists. The amount of people that hold a magazine and see art is
huge.
The numbers
are way bigger.
It's way bigger. Than let's go even bigger. A even bigger form of representation that became prominent was film. Right. Exactly.
I mean, nobody's watching a film of just abstract shapes, sort of random shapes showing up on the screen.
Stan Brakhage. People watch that film. Just relatively no one, right? So compared to a blockbuster, compared to Casablanca, nobody's watching that, right? So it's super meaningful stuff. It's a super meaningful shift. The fact that it became a cultural touchstone is super meaningful. But I like that you use the word representation. I like that word too. And I've been thinking a lot about this and trying to figure out some formats to investigate this more thoroughly, because I find in my conversation anyway, representation is a very important word, because it includes Mark Rothko, for instance, who's sometimes representing seascapes in his super abstract way. But I find that if you go far enough into abstraction, Anish Kapoor, for instance, I use his Cloudgate as an example. His Cloudgate is so divorced from representation, because it's not trying to represent anything at all, that it actually is just a thing. It's as close to being perfectly realistic as possible, because it's not in any way trying to represent something else. So it exists on its own terms to represent itself in its singularity, and that's it. So the word representation, I don't know if it's the most useful word to describe someone like Anish Kapoor or that artwork, but if you are discussing representation, you can't exactly exclude that end of the spectrum, because it exists, and to think that somehow representation doesn't end at photorealism, but allows just 2 degrees to the left or right of that, come on, representation is anything and everything in a way.
And so is abstraction. And this is why I think I really wish there was a reframing of the conversation about these matters, because I think the question isn't whether somebody's making representational work or non-representational work, or abstraction or non-abstract, right? The question is what form of those two things are they taking, right? That's it. Like, what form of abstraction am I employing,
Yeah.
and what form of representation am I employing,
Yeah.
and how are those two things marrying
Yeah.
in such a way that provides the viewer with a new experience
Right.
to both of those things.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting story that people have told themselves about art history, that the case, that those things have divided and they're never going to meet. They never meet. Think of this. But even within the fine art world, in the last 55 years, okay, what has been, if you take the dominant thread of a genre in the fine art world, I would argue that the most dominant thread is pop art. Right? If you look at it from Warhol all the way to now, it has gone unabated. I mean, in some way. I mean, doesn't mean it's the most, it doesn't mean at any given time it's the most popular. It's just the most dominant, like in terms of its longevity, right? And pop art employs by necessity representation. Like, so the idea that it's been killed off. Now look, people who want to paint like Bouguereau might say, well, that's not, but that's, okay. But I'm not having that conversation because because
a false dichotomy. Like, you don't.
It's a false because they want to set the false dichotomy.
Right. And you don't need to exist in a world where only Bouguereau exists or only pop art exists. For me, the most exciting world is where those things are in conversation with each other,
they coexist,
right? or argument with each other. Yeah,
an argument. It's perfectly valid for two things to be accepted within the same realm,
right?
And yet at friction.
Yeah.
I mean, if they were. So here's the thing. Here's another way a metaphor for thinking about this. If they were not close to each other, they wouldn't be in friction, but they are in friction.
Right.
So that means they must be in proximity. It has to be that way.
Yeah.
And
that's a great way to put it. Like, there's no friction if there's not proximity, right?
Yeah. It simply can't exist that way.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting conversation. It doesn't mean that there are certain forms of representation, or not forms, but techniques of representation that sort of fell out of favor and came back.
Yeah.
But that's always going to be the case.
Yeah.
I mean, that's never going to really those fluctuations are never really going to change. We don't. Yeah. The fluctuations are actually what make it interesting. But I would like to see like a more accepting conversation on those terms among the different parties. Yeah. I don't think we're going to get it from certain people, but that's because for whatever part of it is because of their investment they have in the institutions in which they're involved,
right?
And it behooves them to keep that separation happening. But I really like that you mentioned Anish Kapoor, because he's one of my favorite artists.
He makes perfect art. It's really perfect.
Right, yeah. And very, I mean, you might not see it in my work, but it's influential to me. And I mean, I don't know if you want to get into that now, things that we could talk about other stuff, but things that I look at, things that I'm interested in. But I have a very particular reason why I'm interested in him and a couple of other artists with similar lines of thinking. I think it's a really fascinating topic. I would like to see a really good forum discussion about this topic of representation and the narrative of art history and how people are interpreting it and so forth.
Well, let me ask you this. Like, I think this might be a good way to segue into some of those artists that are important to you and what you're looking at, thinking about. I think, in that conversation of representation, your work is decidedly representational, right?
Yeah, so, absolutely. Yep.
You're not Mark Rothkoing, in too many moments in your artwork.
Yeah.
And when you're sketching, that kind of resonates as a process step, like these kind of quicker terracottas.
Right.
They resonate as like the incipient moments of what later would become this more refined thing. But that said, I feel like, having known your work for a long time and having known you for a long time, your artwork is more, I find it to be more conversant with contemporary complicated art thinking, meaning like art thinking that is a broad spectrum, isn't like genre based. And your artwork has like a number of, let's say, bold triggers and then subtle triggers, or bold insinuations or illusions, and then subtle illusions. And I think the boldest ones can bring us to a place where we're like, all right, Brian's like like a representational figurative sculptor.
Right.
That's it. And the subtle ones are, could you? I think maybe I don't know what you would think about this terminology, but it's almost like you risk. They're so subtle in your artwork that you risk people missing it. So so I'm wondering, like, I kind of want to frame this conversation a little bit around, like, let's say an artist statement. Like do you find that prefacing or not prefacing your artwork with like a statement or an understanding helps people, or do you not want to do that, or how do you dance around that idea that people could look at your work quick with like not enough scrutiny or not enough time if they just glance at it as they're scrolling through, or if they're in a gallery and they're like, that's a nice sculpture, and miss some of the subtlety, which is so subtle, or some of the narrative clues, which are sometimes even hidden like behind a back or something like that. So if they don't walk around, they won't see it.
They're not going to see it.
So I think the play there is really interesting, because I like those ideas too, where you're asking and inviting the viewer, like, hey, you better come hang out and spend time and decode this. But you risk them not, right? And having your reputation or your process fall into another category.
Get pushed to the other side. This is. I'm really glad you bring this up, just because this actually has been one of my personal struggles with what I do. Because I do feel like the subtleties are too subtle sometimes. They're not subtle to me because I'm the one that does them.
You made them. They're there.
Because I made them. But I've had plenty of moments where I've had people say something, standing and talk to me about it, and they'll say something about a work, but they never walk around it or they get closer to see something else that's going on.
And if you're talking to a person like me, I'm like the most likely person in the world to pick up on your subtleties. You know what I mean? Like me and a certain group of people are just geared to look for that stuff. So the average person is not, right? Like they're not programmed in that way. They didn't go to art school, for instance. That's right. Or
if they did go to art school, they weren't trained in the language of the language that I'm using, the syntax that I'm employing, right? So the syntax that I'm employing can look. It's like anything else. If you're not a wine connoisseur, if you've never had wine in your life, you're gonna be like, Barolo,
it's all the same.
It's like all the same. It's like like what's the big deal about wine? This shit's all the same. It's kind of like that. Yeah. And by the way, I would say this is true for people who go to a school where they learn, the only thing they learn is representational techniques, right? Some sort of atelier system. They go and they look at abstract expressionist paintings. They're like, they all look the same. But they don't all look the same. They don't all look the same. You have to spend time with them. You have to spend time. And you may not. And you have to. I think this is really important. I think people need to accept the fact that there may be things they don't fully understand.
Right.
That's totally okay. Like you can look at something for years and still try to figure and not totally understand it. Right. On a variety of levels or in a variety of facets as well, different sides of it. But so anyway, I'm glad you bring this up, because this is one of my big struggles. Am I being too subtle sometimes? Or sometimes am I just like giving up on the subtlety and just saying, okay, forget it, just like show the thing. And there's a range in my work that way. I mean, you have to sort of go through everything to see that, but I do struggle with that. And so to your question, I do feel that the statement is kind of important. I do think it's somewhat important for me to frame it so that people can see it a certain way. Now, obviously, one of the issues of being an artist is that you lose control over the meaning of things over time. You do. Meanings change. And it's natural for them to change.
And they should change.
They should change. They should change. Context changes. Culture changes. People change.
So intentionality is just one context by which your art might be viewed, right?
That's right. And so my intentionality, I think that's true for most artists. I think it's rather important to try to define it in as concise and clear terms as possible for the viewing public. particularly, and it's mostly for people who are unfamiliar. I don't think you would need to read the statement you might get something out of it that you hadn't thought, but you would need to read it in order to understand the syntax
Right.
of the thing. But for people who don't have that, it's helpful. And so I think it's another reason why not just statements, but I like doing podcasts and talking with people and whatever magazine, article, whatever. It gives me an opportunity to say something that might cause somebody to say, "Oh, I didn't see that the first time, and so maybe let's have a second look at it." And so, for me, that's a very important aspect of what I do. I try not to spend too much time on the writing of it, but I spend a hell of a lot of time thinking about it. Because I think it's important for me to be able to have a conversation with people about this and what I'm attempting to do, and a conversation with myself so I can see how it's changing over time. And so I don't know, one of the things that I think it's important for me to state when I'm talking to people is that verisimilitude is not the goal.
Right.
Verisimilitude is one of the means. It's not the only means. It's only one of the means. So the goal is something a little more uncanny, and right. It's what I'm really most interested in when it comes to sculptural representation of human beings is a sort of primal eminence that they have, right? Which now you could say is in current psychological theory has to do with the uncanny valley and our associations with objects that represent things that we recognize, particularly people, because that's the thing that we think that we know the most. So that's the more interesting part to me, is the way that it can create an interaction between the object and the person. That to me is the goal. So there are layers.
Verisimilitude is, in terms of your art, I would say it's the loudest of the indicators. Like it's the most pronounced and most obvious one. So in terms of like a hierarchy of how people might start to perceive whether they are expert or public, right? Whether they're art trained or not trained. The verisimilitude or the closeness to nature is the thing that will strike. That's the invitation, right? Like that's the invitation to the show. And so the hope, I think, in your artwork is that they take that invitation and they take that as you convincing them to spend more time investigating or decoding in a way. Yeah, and that part you don't always have control over, right? Because they can take the invitation and just be like, okay, this is verisimilitude, period.
Anything, if it's verist in nature, that can be a stopping point for some people. Yeah. Because they assume that that's all that it's about, right? It's like it corresponds to a visual phenomenon, but it only corresponds. That's the problem. It only corresponds. It doesn't meet it, right? It doesn't meet the actual visual phenomenon. It only corresponds to their experience of a visual phenomenon, and they think that that's where it ends. But of course, that's not the case. So
do people often ask you, like, I think there's an overlap. I mean, there's a lot of overlaps between our artworks, and there's a lot of divergences between the way we work and stuff like that, which is an interesting conversation. But I think one of the overlaps might be I often when I'm having a conversation about my artwork, the topic of that conversation is, what is this person's story? And you've been talking a lot about this in the conversations you've been having online, is what does it mean, sculptural narrative? Where does narrative come from? And you've been talking a lot about material narrative. And I feel like your artwork is one that would urge, people of all stripes to ask, well, what is this lady's story, or what is this guy's story? And but when I hear you talk, I, like myself, when I talk about the story of my sculptures, it's like in its simplest form, the story of my sculpture is, I made a sculpture once. I wasn't totally happy with it. I remembered Rachel White Reed. and then I did something different, and then I was kind of happy with that, and then I thought about Jenny Seville for a while, and then and then like I made this thing, and then people liked it, and that's it.
Yeah, right.
And but they want a story that, as you put it in one of your recent talks, follows a narrative trajectory that more sounds like a plot-based narrative. Like, this person, I made this as a response to a story I read about a young girl who escaped Auschwitz or something like that. And and that's not where the idea came from. That's not where the form or the composition or the posture or any of the things that went into it came from.
Right.
So when you're talking about working in the studio, like how do you try to get that across, or how do you does that come from the statement? Does that come from these talks or these podcasts, or how do you try to get that across if people are looking for the narrative?
Right. That's a tough one, because a certain sense because it's out of our control to a degree.
Yeah.
Right. There's only so much you can do with that. I think here's how I try to do it, and to greater or lesser degree of success. Because again, it's not a plot-driven narrative. There's not an arc to the story, because one of the problems with sculpture and the dilemmas with sculpture is it's not a naturally narrative art form. Okay, it doesn't have the structure of, say, a painting, which can have multiple narrative spaces compressed together, right? So in other words, you could have different elements of the story happening at the same time, developing, and the way it works psychologically is your mind reads it as a plot, because you have to follow through the narrative space.
Clue,
some kind of clue, right?
Yeah.
And
can I jump in for a second? That's so interesting, because I actually think of that differently. Like, this will be like a good artist disagreement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we may not disagree, actually, because there's more to say about this. Yeah.
But what I would say sculpturally is I'm a huge comics guy. I've always been a comics person, and I love sequentiality. And I especially love these paintings, like these Netherlandish paintings that, or even like the ukiyo-e, like Japanese wood print style, like the floating world style, where they actually describe smaller compositions within the overall composition, so that you're forced in a way to develop a sequentiality within an overall one thing. But the thing that I've always enjoyed about making sculpture is that people are forced to develop a sequentiality, because they cannot see the entirety of the sculpture from one view.
Right. This is what I was going to say.
Yeah. So of course we don't disagree, right? But but you're talking about this before with like the subtlety, where you're like, oh, I need this person to walk behind and marry that view to the front view, but they can't see the front view at the same time. So they have to add it up in their head, which to me develops a plot in time. So I usually describe it like oppositely, where I think like sculpture is the most narrative, but it doesn't follow that arc. It's a completely arbitrary arc, kind of like the book Siddhartha, where the chapters can be rearranged or can be discussed in any order and have an uncertain result, right? So that's what I enjoy about it, and I think for me, I'm happiest when artwork doesn't resolve. I often don't want to know what artists think, because I'm very happy guessing for the rest of my life why Brian made this choice or that choice or this choice. And if you tell me, like, it narrows it down to a certainty, and then I don't get to fight with myself or with the artwork or discover new things about it or new contexts, as it goes through time. So anyway, can you continue? Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah. So no, that's actually no. You said it. What I was going to say is that here's how I would describe it. The painting is internally narrative, and sculpturally is externally narrative.
Yes.
This was one of Rodin's great revelations. Was that you interact the viewer in the space of the thing, so you become part of the space. So I don't know if we did this together when we were in Rome, but if we go to when you go to Santa Maria del Popolo, which is where those two great Caravaggios are, the St. Paul and the conversion of Paul and the crucifixion of Peter, and then another chapel is where the two Bernini's, where there's the Habakkuk and the angel and the Daniel in the lion's den, right? And it's a chapel, small chapel.
Yeah.
And so the story, of course, is those characters. Okay, there's the story. But then you have to presuppose that the knowledge of the story to a certain degree. Okay, but the key element to that success of that is the viewer, who has to stand in the middle, because the chapel, the dome of the chapel and the floor of the chapel were designed by Raphael 100 years before, give or take, a decade. But
circa,
I can't remember exact dates. Yeah, circa. About 100 years before. And the dome, in the cupola of the dome, there's a mosaic of God sort of looking down, okay, and looking straight down into the chapel. And on the floor, directly below that, where you stand as a viewer, is a skeleton coming out of the ground, right? Sort of a mosaic on the ground, like it's coming out of hell or coming out of purgatory or whatever it might be. But resurrecting. Okay. So you stand in the middle. You look up. There's God. There's resurrected skeleton, and then on either side of the chapel, you have Habakkuk and the angel and Daniel in the lion's den. Okay. Now those stories are connected in the Old Testament. One is in the Apocrypha, and the other one is in the traditional Bible, but what the Protestants would call the Apocrypha. And so the story is Habakkuk was praying, and God told him to take food to Daniel, who was in the lion's den. And Daniel in the lion's den was praying to God to receive the food. So Daniel has this gesture where he's looking up, at God over this dome. And on the opposite side is Habakkuk, and there's an angel lifting him up, pointing up at heaven, and you're standing in the middle.
Yeah.
The story doesn't work without you.
Right.
The story doesn't work without you.
Yeah.
It doesn't work without you. It can't work without you. It's the space, the narrative space. So that's the way I would describe it. Or again, the example of Rodin, where his great masterpiece this way is the Burghers of Calais, which he specifically wanted it on the ground. They wanted it up on a pedestal and said, no, it has to be on the ground. Because what he wanted was because if you can't ever see the whole thing from any point of view, that's the way sculpture is. Right. You have to walk around it. Now you've become a participant in the emotional narrative of each of the characters as they're displayed. So you're an element of that. So that's, it's not so much that sculpture is like externally narrative, and painting is more internally narrative. Like a play would be internally narrative, or a movie would be internally narrative, right? There's a story with an arc and everything, beginning and end, and character development, all this. Okay, whereas sculpture doesn't have that element. So sculpture is less descriptive and more evocative. That's another way of putting it, right? Yeah. That's another way to say it. It's and when it is descriptive, it tends to come across as a little bit too ham-fisted, right?
Yeah. Well, right? I mean, when you say descriptive, do you mean didactic, like
didactic, right?
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so, or that's the great strength of sculpture. In my opinion, I agree with Baudelaire in his essay from 1846 of the Salon of 1846, where he wrote this essay called, he was like critiquing the sculpture in the Salon of 1846, and the title of the essay is "Why Sculpture is Boring." And his point was what had happened was the sculptors at that time had lost the sense of what he called sculpture as a Carib art form, like a primal art form, right? This basic, like it should hit some primal element in you. And what was happening, they were making and he said, you could take the plaques and you could just change them. One was St. Paul and one was Aristotle. You could just switch them and nobody would know the difference, because they're just, all they are is describing a guy in a robe, Yeah. They're not really evoking any kind of any feeling in the viewer, any notion of the character's being. Okay?
So in a way, this is the in the crudest sense, maybe in the most unhelpful sense, this is the classic illustration versus art conversation, like
sort
didactic
of
versus
sure, sort of, but I don't think he meant it in that way, though.
Yeah.
I think what he meant was more that it became, the didacticism became sort of bland. It was not like, it was interchangeable. Like they just became interchangeable stories. They could just remove the head of one saint and put the other one on. It wasn't, there was nothing essential in the
Right,
illustration
okay.
of the didacticism, right?
Yeah.
So that's so where are we going with this? We were talking. We went off on a couple tangents. We were talking about narrative.
Who knows?
And there was a question in there about 10 minutes ago. But
Yeah.
So
It's
we're
okay.
talking about. Oh, I know. So the in terms of the narrative element of sculpture,
Right.
we've been talking a lot about this, and how do I deal with it in the studio? I think that was your question. That was actually the question, right? And what do I do within the studio to create the conditions whereby the narrative is not simply a didactic narrative, say, for example, right? Okay, that was the question. So, and I in my typical fashion, of course, I had to lay all the groundwork for describing what narrative is, so that what I say makes sense. But so I was starting off by saying that narrative acts differently in painting. It's like sculpture is not an internally native, a natural native narrative art form. Okay, whereas say movies are. Okay, so with sculpture, it has this ability to evoke something, a presence, like a real, almost like a spiritual presence. I was talking to somebody recently. I think I would call myself an animist. Maybe not in the sense that people used it long ago, but I would call myself an animist. Like the whole world is animated to me. It's filled with some sort of eminence that I'm not sure what it is. But sculpture is very good at doing that, right? And this will get back to what we're going to talk about with artists, right? And why I like people like Anish Kapoor. So when I'm in the studio and I'm thinking about the way in which the object that I'm working on will interact with the viewer. Okay, I try to put any specific narrative out of my mind. Okay, the temptation for anyone, just as you said, anyone who goes to a gallery, they're going to look for the narrative in it. They're going to look for what's my narrative of the person who made it. And that's the biggest pitfall of all, in my opinion, because I make my things ambiguous enough that they wouldn't be able to figure out the object's narrative. Like they're not looking at it and saying, oh, this is obviously Daniel in the Lion's Den, right? Yeah. Like I'm not picking a narrative and applying it.
Right.
So I do open myself up to a lot of speculation about my narrative in the making of it. Okay. But in terms of the object itself, I'm looking for ambiguities, and I'm looking for ambiguities of gesture or look. The fact of the matter is that it's already an ambiguous situation. How many people would encounter a person in the nude, standing there, staring at you?
Right. Yeah.
On it, it doesn't happen. It's not. It's already an odd situation that I'm putting people in, right? So I've already got to start. Like I don't have to, in other words, I'm not sculpting people sitting in a book chair reading a book,
Right.
which is a quotidian experience. People have it all the time. It's a fairly ubiquitous thing that happens. I'm not depicting people in that way. I'm depicting them. That's one of the reasons I like the nude, because I've suddenly stripped them of any kind of everyday experience that people would have with them. Okay, and I've also
really the only experiences we have with nude, it would be with our parents, but then that stops. Our doctor, and our lovers, and crime. Like that's it, right?
Yeah,
I mean, or film, right? Or maybe pornography, right? Would be the only real exposure we have to nudity in those contexts, and then art is another one.
Is another one, yeah. And two of those examples are not direct experiences.
Right.
They're mediated experiences.
Exactly.
So that's a little bit of what I'm playing with, is the discomfort you feel with this suddenly confronted with something that is an unusual situation.
Yeah.
And so that's I already have a starting point for for the narrative element, the internally narrative element,
Yeah.
not external, but the internally narrative element. And so I'm not thinking about when something occurs to me, an object to put in the hand, or a particular gesture to give. I'm not thinking about, oh, this is what this person did. She did this, and it meant this, and then they did this, right? I'm not thinking about that at all. In fact, I consider myself the first viewer of the piece. I'm oftentimes just as confused as other people.
Right.
I'm thinking, not confused. I'm intrigued. Intrigued is a better word. I'm just as intrigued. I think, well, that element goes with that element. Why does it work? Why does it work? What is it saying? What is it, And so that's how I do it. I automatically create conditions for myself where I remove the temptation to add a narrative component that would be too identifiable.
Right.
That's it. I mean, that's it. Once you've done that, you immediately create space for yourself. No, having said that, there's an opposite to everything, right? So what I just said is that there's obviously a way in which you could create a quotidian experience, and by the application of an artistic method, make that quotidian experience feel new.
Yeah.
And suddenly displace all the assumptions people have about that narrative, which is kind of what you do, actually, in some ways.
Yeah.
Well,
in a way, yeah.
in the drawings especially.
Yeah. But I'll give you a sculptural example of that I witnessed, and in the figurative sense, was at the African American History Museum, where in that space they have depictions of slaves, and they're life-size bronzes, and one of their concepts was to recontextualize the depiction of a slave character. And basically what they did in certain circumstances is they made them, instead of having the usual, after being whipped or toiling in the field or something like that, they had them up on a pedestal, their feet were, about chest height with you. They were standing up looking like human beings. Yeah, and they had some of the signifiers of to narratively get you to immediately understand, okay, this is a slave character. But recontextualizing it like that was, to say that it was a new experience, this was one of these visceral experiences you have, because you realize it's like part of the matrix had been revealed, where you're like, oh, I've been thoroughly brainwashed visually my entire life, and just this moment of seeing this thing is this massive peeling back of the matrix, where you're like, whoa, I had no idea how visually brainwashed I had been. So that's that one's a little bit less ambiguous than what you're talking about.
Sure.
But it operates in that same space where the viewer, the relationship of the viewer, the posture, the gesture, all of these things, they reflect back on the narrative that you have in your head, and the visualization of that narrative that you have in your head. And the fight that your brain has in that moment, the whatever you want to call it, the dislocation of neural pathways is so intense, at least for me, that
isn't that in a way, that's a great way of describing it. In a way, isn't that what all good art does? Is it upsets the viewer's presumptions.
Right. Yeah.
Right. See, when you're describing that, I was thinking of Kara Walker, right?
Right.
And how she does the same thing. In a different way. Of course, she's pushing it to the other extreme, which is taking all of these paradigms we have in our head about what it means, and she suddenly she really pushes you far in that direction, and makes you uncomfortable with, oh wait, this is what these depictions actually mean. So it really upsets some of your preconceptions, and so that's what happened to you in that experience. You were expecting one thing, and when it didn't give you what you expected, now it pushed it back on you and said,
exactly, right.
Oh wait, that's great, it's brilliant.
And this is something I always say, I don't like art that I like art that bothers me, that stays with me. And so,
Right.
you know, the longer an artwork lingers in my conscience or subconscious, or the longer it works at undoing some of those neural pathways or whatever, those are the works that I like, the ones that stay, whether I'm comfortable with them or uncomfortable with them or what. That's like kind of not the point for me about art. And it's an interesting, like, I know like a lot of schools are you know, pushing in this direction, and a lot of definitions of art are starting to narrow into, well, art is disruption, which is kind of what you just said, right? Like the best art disrupts something. And it, you know, it's interesting to think about your art in that way, because it sounds like you're pretty intent on disrupting some of the preconceived narratives that go along with classical figuration or traditional figuration or whatever you want to call it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, though. Like, I don't think all art has to disrupt necessarily. Disrupt might be the right, it's the right word and the wrong word. Like, I think it makes us rethink our presumptions about things. That's what I think it is. It's more. It's not. So and I think what you just said is true for me too. It's one of the reasons that, you know, I think there must be something to Cy Twombly, even though I can't figure out what it is that I don't like. Why I'm like, I have a hard time connecting to it, but it won't go away. Like, for some reason, I can't get it out of my head. I'm like, and I'm still trying to figure it out. So my charitable assumption is that he must know something I don't know, because I don't get it, you know, and it won't get out of my head. Like, if it was nothing, I would just be, you know, I could just swat it away. You know, but I can't, for whatever reason, and so, you know, I just operate now under this assumption that, okay, there's a disconnect. It's obviously upsetting my assumptions about what art is.
Yeah.
So that must mean something.
Yeah.
I automatically create that assumption in myself. That doesn't mean I have to like it, like you said, in the way of liking it means, right? There are different kinds of like. You know, so yeah, because I mean, you don't want to eat just chocolate ice cream. I mean, I don't know what kind of ice cream you like, but I like mint chocolate chip, actually. It would be pretty cloying if you only had chocolate ice cream for every meal. I think after the third day, you'd be like, I need some veggies. So I do think that's part of what makes art exciting, and I think it's an important thing to say too, because, like you said, you like comics. Like, it's really fascinating to hear people talk about the things that they look at, or that they've always sort of enjoyed in different ways, right? Because
it means something.
You said because you said you know, comics on one side, and then there's this other, you know, other kind of artwork that you make, like Anish Kapoor. You know, they're very different things. They don't have to satisfy the same thirst. Why
like ice cream and vegetables, right? Like,
right.
It's like,
yeah, I mean, one is a pleasure and one is well, they both can be pleasures, but they're different kinds of pleasures.
Yeah,
right? So
just, like maybe they're just different parts of the brain or something like that.
Yeah, and I want all parts of my brain stimulated, so I don't want to just. Yeah, you might remember this when I was teaching at Lyme. You know, I always tell students that I'm teaching them what I know. I have a limited range of everybody does. I mean, it doesn't matter how brilliant you are. Everybody has a limited range of experience, knowledge, and applied knowledge to their experience. And so I can only teach what I teach. But my goal was never to make them sculpt like me, right? That was never my goal. My goal was never to create clones. My goal was to help them figure out who they wanted to be and help them get there, right? That's it. The goal of education, this is my... you can quote me, but just give me credit for it. This is my formulation of it. Is the goal of education, of a teacher, and this is parenting too, is to help a student understand the world and find their place in it.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically it. You know, that's your job, and that's how I treated it when I was a professor. It didn't always work.
I have a similar one where I say something more like, at its best, when everything is right, when the student is there for the right reason and the teacher is there for the right reason, the teacher is spending time with the student while the student navigates themselves and the world around them.
Right.
And you're there as a mentor more than you ever are as an instructor or a tutor or anything like that. And so you can play those roles of instructor and tutor, or of context giver, or of expectation giver. But really you're just spending time with a person. And that's for me, teaching at its most ideal is you're just with that person as they make their way through their goal sets and their context.
And it's going to be about them. Well, anyway, same idea though. And the thing is, the key point to that I was going to make is that, and that's a good way to say it, what you said, because what you're describing is two people on a journey.
Right.
There are two people on
different
journeys,
places,
right? In different places, right? And so the reason, part of the reason I would tell students that is because the only way that they're going to get where they want to go is if they do also encounter things that aren't like what they're doing.
Exactly.
Right. And in other words,
Challenged.
You cannot understand. Yeah, you need to not only challenge but contextualize.
Yeah.
You can't know what it is you're doing without the context around you.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the reasons why I've tried really hard to look as much art as I can from different cultures, different periods, different genres, whatever, is because I think it's the only way I'm going to be the best version of myself. Yeah. If I only look at things that look like what I do, it's like playing tennis with myself.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to get any better. Like I'm just going to be like, oh, I know that move. That guy Brian does it. He always backhands. I don't play tennis, but you get the metaphor. Yeah. So like teaching is very much like that. You're trying to help students see that, okay, you don't have to make art like me. You should try to understand what I'm doing, because not because I want you to imitate me, but because having the context of what I do will help you understand what you want to do. And if only as a matter of friction, right? Like we were saying before. Yeah. And so I really firmly believe that. I think that's such a key aspect of being an artist, and particularly a contemporary artist.
This is why I've always enjoyed talking to you. But when we were in Rome together, one of the things that you do in your coursework is you expose the students to Rome, and one of the things I really enjoyed about that was not only that you give a historical perspective and context, you give a sense, like you just did for the chapel you were describing, of why the decisions were made, who made those decisions, how they did, but you immediately recontextualize that into a more modern framework that's not excluding any kind of like thinking. So it's one that can make meaningful no matter what kind of art you're making. And put into a modern context all of these classical ideas or ideas from antiquity that are still quite contemporary ideas and have been, maybe sometimes discussed as antiquated, right? Which I think is sometimes the wrong word for them. So I've always really appreciated that about you and about your art is how you can take something that at a glance might feel or look or be of a genre or of a time period and give us enough. I always think of it as, like I said, an invitation. Like there's so much invitation in it. There's so much richness of thought and experience and execution and technique that I feel compelled to stay with it, for so long. And find everything out about it, So I've always really appreciated that about your work, about your teaching. It's really
thank you,
lovely.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Well, I think that's you bring up another interesting thought there about like looking at history, and people have this presumption that they can't relate to it because it's from it's from a culture that they're not from, or from a time period where they don't understand, and so therefore it no longer has relevance and so forth. But the reality is, if you were to take that logic and extend it out, that would mean you couldn't really look at anything.
You couldn't talk to anyone.
You couldn't talk to anyone because I don't know your experience. Your experience is unique, and the other thing about that is that everything is working as art because of the context of everything else. And
exactly, right.
it requires it. It absolutely requires it. And I guess you would have to assume that we've evolved beyond the making of art to then think that it no longer applies. Right. I was talking the other day to a friend on Instagram, and this is true. Whenever I think about art and I think about, what is it? Why do I make it? Where are we? How do we get here? I always go back and look at the cave paintings. Like, that's what I go. Yeah. I mean, it's all right there. Yeah. It's all right there. Like, if you think there's been great advancement in the making of art in the last 40,000 years, you're fooling yourself. I mean, we basically went to Mars when we were in caves, and we've just been orbiting Mars for the last 40,000 years, right? Yeah, I mean, whatever metaphor you want to use there, but that's how I think of it.
Like, and the big jump happened a long time ago.
It happened a long time ago.
So even this idea of like technology and like how fast all that's advancing, that's kind of within the scope of that big jump.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And the application of collective brain power on technology is not an indicator of the advancement of our individual intellectual capability of the last 10,000 years.
Or capacity. That's right.
Or capacity. Yeah. It doesn't. We shouldn't fool ourselves to think that. So we're still dealing with the same fundamental issues.
Right. Yeah.
This whatever existential crisis caused us to put a handprint on the wall. Yeah. Right.
Well, listen, Brian. If there's ever a good place to pause, it's that existential crisis. So listen, I want to thank you for coming on, man. As always, it's absolute pleasure to talk with you. And obviously we have to do this 10 to 50 more times because
I know
this conversation is obviously not over. So
no, there's a lot we could have talked about. I really wanted to get into talking about artists that we look at and
right. Well, let's make that part two because
let's do that part two because I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this too. This is I think we started touching on it. We started teasing on it a little bit, talking about these people, things that we look at and why we look at different things, whether it's comic book to Anish Kapoor and Cy Twombly, and I think this is like important stuff. Yeah, and I really want to hear more from you also about your thoughts about all that, how all those things, all those connective tissues all intertwine.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's do that. We'll make a date and talk about exactly that, and
that'd be awesome.
Everybody can tune in and find out all the neurotic ways in which we've thought about art for the last how long? Too long.
Yeah, that would be fun.
All right, Brian. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. Thanks, you too. Good night. Good morning.